My name is Brian Walker, and for most of my adult life, I believed in quiet stability. Not passion, not fairy tales, just stability. Caitlin and I built our life around that. We lived in a calm neighborhood just outside Milwaukee, in a one-story home with a picket fence, 2 oak trees out front, and a detached garage where I liked to tinker on things that didn't matter. Old bikes, broken radios, a leaf blower that hadn't worked since 2019. I told myself I enjoyed fixing things because I understood them. They had parts, manuals, logic. When they stopped working, there was always a reason. I wish I could say the same about people. That Friday evening in May started like most others. I had finished a modest freelance contract that afternoon, doing back-end code for a local logistics firm. Nothing exciting, but it paid decently. Caitlin had said she was going out with 2 of her girlfriends, a casual girls' night dinner at a new tapas place downtown. I didn't think much of it. She went out from time to time, and I never questioned it. I trusted her. That's the part that stings the most in hindsight. I was in the garage by 9:30 p.m. A wrench in my hand and a podcast playing in the background. I'd taken apart the brake system on an old Schwinn Continental I found at a yard sale, determined to restore it to working condition. My hands were covered in grease, and the smell of metal and chain oil filled the air. I remember feeling strangely content, like I was accomplishing something, even if it was small. At 10:04 p.m., I heard the front door slam. Not close. Slam. It made me jump, and I dropped the wrench with a loud clang. The sound wasn't violent, but it wasn't right either. It was too sharp, too urgent, like someone trying to mask a presence with forced normalcy. Caitlin appeared in the doorway to the garage about 30 seconds later, carrying a small white cardboard box with a dessert logo on it and flashing me a wide, tired smile. Her makeup was untouched. Not the smudged look of someone who'd spent hours in a noisy restaurant laughing with friends. Her lipstick was still perfect, eyeliner crisp. She wasn't holding her shoes like she usually did when her feet hurt. She was still wearing them. 4-inch heels she rarely chose unless it was for something more formal than tapas with friends. The box had 3 leftover chocolate tarts. She said her friend Ashley couldn't finish hers, so they let her take them home. Caitlin spoke quickly, with an energy that felt unnatural. Her voice was upbeat but strained, the way someone might sound after too much caffeine or guilt. I wasn't suspicious yet, just off balance. It was like a delay in sound during a movie. Everything seemed normal, but not quite aligned. And then I saw the jacket. Through the back window of her car, half shielded by the passenger headrest, lay a folded men's jacket. Dark wool with a leather collar. Not mine. Not her father's, he lived in Florida now. Not her brother's, he wore only denim and Carhartt. I hadn't seen that jacket before in my life. She must have noticed my gaze because she glanced over her shoulder and, without missing a beat, said something about accidentally grabbing it when they were leaving the restaurant. It must have gotten mixed up at coat check, she claimed, waving it off like it happened all the time. But we live in Wisconsin. In May. It was nearly 70 degrees that night. Nobody was wearing a coat thick enough to need coat check. The story didn't line up, not even a little. She didn't offer to go back in and eat the dessert. Didn't come sit beside me like she sometimes did. Instead, she told me she'd better return the jacket quickly. She felt bad holding on to it. Then she turned, box still in hand, and went back to the car. That moment, her body disappearing into the night again without hesitation, felt like watching someone walk away with the end of a rope you hadn't realized was slipping out of your hands. The taillights glowed red, steady and unbothered, and I didn't call after her. I didn't run inside or demand answers. I just stood there, next to the unfinished bike, listening to the quiet hum of suburban nightfall and wondering why my stomach felt hollow. It wasn't proof. That's important to say. There was no lipstick-stained collar or mystery text on her screen. Just a strange jacket, a too-perfect smile, and a woman who'd never once cared to return anyone's lost coat before. But there was something deeper beneath all that. A stillness inside me that had shifted, like when a picture frame tilts on the wall, not fallen yet but no longer straight. I stood there for another 20 minutes, looking at the ground, remembering the last few months, and realizing how many small things I'd ignored. The missed calls, the changed scent of her perfume, the casual indifference she developed toward me, like I had become a fixture in the home, no longer a person with gravity. I didn't try to text her. I didn't want her to know I was thinking about the jacket. Instead, I walked back inside, set the dessert box on the counter, washed my hands slowly at the sink, and sat down in the living room. The couch felt colder than usual. I turned on the TV and scrolled through a few shows without really watching anything. I didn't know what I was waiting for. Her return? An apology? A miracle? She came back after midnight. I heard the key turn quietly, like she didn't want to wake me. She moved gently through the hallway, and I closed my eyes, pretending to be asleep. But I wasn't. I was thinking about the jacket, thinking about how she'd driven across town just to return something that didn't belong to her. And the strangest part? It didn't feel like betrayal yet. It felt like being left out of a secret, like walking into a room where a conversation had just ended, and everyone's smiling too hard. That was the first crack. And even though the surface looked intact, I knew, deep down, that everything beneath it had started to break. The next morning, Caitlin acted like nothing had happened. She was already up when I came into the kitchen. The smell of fresh coffee filled the air, and she was at the counter making toast, humming softly to herself, a tune I didn't recognize. Her hair was damp, her face clean of makeup. She wore an oversized t-shirt from college, and for a moment, everything looked normal. Ordinary, domestic, but something inside me didn't reset with the sun. I couldn't stop thinking about the night before, about the jacket, her too smooth exit, the way her story had holes I couldn't patch no matter how hard I tried. So I said nothing. I just nodded at her, poured my coffee, and sat at the table, my mind spinning behind my still face. That entire day passed in strange silence. Not the kind born of anger. We weren't fighting. We weren't even cold. We were just muted, like two actors reading different scripts. I watched her clean the kitchen with unnecessary focus. I watched her fold laundry she normally let pile up. I watched her look at me when she thought I wasn't paying attention. But I was finally paying attention. It's incredible how clearly you can see the past when you start doubting the present. Like rewinding a tape and realizing everything you missed the first time. That day, my brain became a theater of moments. Dozens of seemingly meaningless scenes that suddenly demanded a second viewing. Like the time 2 months ago when Caitlin changed her phone password. We had always been casual about that. Our phones weren't locked away like vaults. If she needed directions, I'd read them off her screen. If she was driving, I'd answer her messages. But one night, I picked up her phone to check the weather, and it had locked me out. She shrugged when I asked, said work was clamping down on security protocols. Something about compliance. I had believed her. And then there was how she started tilting her screen when texting ever so slightly. At dinner, in bed, in the car. Not enough to be obvious, but just enough to hide. I catch her smiling at a message and then quickly switching to a recipe app or the weather widget. It had become a new reflex, one I'd noticed and then convinced myself wasn't worth confronting. I remembered her work events, which had started getting longer. Caitlin had always been career-driven. A marketing manager who could juggle deadlines with one hand and spreadsheets with the other. But recently, those events no longer ended at a respectable hour. What used to be 6 p.m. Meetups were now stretching into 10, even 11 p.m. Sometimes she wouldn't get home until after midnight, blaming last-minute changes or difficult clients. The strangest part? She stopped complaining about the stress. She used to vent about every mistake her team made, every typo in a slide deck. But now, she seemed almost energized after those late nights, glowing in a way that didn't match the story. Even her wardrobe changed. She started buying new lingerie, expensive stuff, lace, silk, unfamiliar brands. But I never saw her wear any of it at home. The tags stayed on for weeks. Some pieces vanished before I ever saw them again. At the time, I told myself she just wanted to feel good. Maybe she was going through a phase. Maybe it wasn't about me. I didn't want to admit what my gut had whispered even back then. Then there was her newfound interest in photography. Caitlin had never been into that before. If anything, she mocked the Instagram crowd. But suddenly she bought a vintage film camera online and started spending weekends at local markets, snapping pictures of people, storefronts, light through trees. I was supportive, even curious. I asked to see her sh*ts once, and she brushed me off, saying they weren't developed yet or that she wasn't happy with the results. Still, her social media slowly shifted. Her posts became more aesthetic, framed carefully, filtered with precision. And almost every single one of those new photos, even the ones of lattes or street lamps, was liked instantly by an account named Shutter Guy. At first, I assumed it was someone from a local photography group, maybe just an enthusiast like her. But the frequency was suspicious. His comments were subtle, a fire emoji here, a great eye there. It wasn't overt, not flirty, but it felt consistent. Too consistent. When I clicked through to his profile, I found a sparse feed. A few artistic sh*ts of city skylines, some abstract shadows on buildings, a couple of moody self-portraits. The kind of account you'd think belonged to someone who didn't want to be fully found. His real name wasn't listed, just Evan G. His bio said visual storyteller, moment hunter. I didn't recognize him from anywhere. I wanted to believe it was harmless, but a sliver of suspicion had wedged itself into my thoughts. Once it was there, it didn't let go. I remembered another moment, one that hadn't seemed important until now. 3 weeks prior, I'd glanced at her phone when a calendar reminder popped up, check-in 12:30. I asked what it was, and she said something about a routine doctor's appointment. Annual checkup, nothing serious. I even offered to drive her. She declined, said she was just going to head there straight from work. But days later, while clearing out our shared inbox, I stumbled on an email she hadn't fully deleted. A reservation confirmation. Boutique hotel. Same date. Same time. Private garden suite. Early check-in requested. My stomach had twisted then, but I buried it under excuses. Maybe she booked it for a friend. Maybe she was surprising me for our anniversary, even though that wasn't for another 4 months. Maybe I didn't want to know the truth. Looking back now, it was like watching a tower fall in reverse. Every stone floating upward, slotting back into place, revealing the elegant construction of a lie I had never questioned. And somehow, I had smiled through it all. There were even smaller moments, the kind that don't scream infidelity, but whisper doubt. Like how she stopped mentioning her coworkers by name. She used to gossip, share stories about office politics. But now, when I asked who she had lunch with, she'd just say the usual crowd. When I pressed, she'd roll her eyes and act like I was prying. I stopped asking. That was my mistake. She also started locking the bathroom door, something she hadn't done in years. And once, I came home early and heard her talking in the bedroom. When I entered, she was alone, sitting on the edge of the bed, phone in hand, acting like she'd just finished a call. She told me it was her sister. I had no reason to doubt it. Not then. But now, every detail felt like a breadcrumb I'd chosen not to follow. Every moment, a red flag I'd recolored to keep the peace. The silence in our home had become a fog, and I had wandered in it willingly. That night, as we sat together on the couch watching some forgettable crime show, I glanced at her and saw a stranger. Her head rested lightly on my shoulder, but I could feel the distance between us like a wall of glass. I didn't know who she was anymore, or worse, when she had stopped being who I thought she was. I stayed quiet. I didn't confront her. Not yet. But my mind was a web of dots, and they were all starting to connect. It happened on a Wednesday. Plain, unremarkable, and gray. The kind of day that drifts by without asking to be remembered. I hadn't planned to come home early. A client call had been canceled last minute, and with nothing else scheduled, I figured I'd use the time to catch up on laundry. Maybe finally fix that loose drawer in the hallway dresser. I didn't text Caitlin to let her know. I wanted the quiet. I wanted a few hours alone to reclaim the house, or maybe to reclaim something in myself. When I pulled into the driveway, her car wasn't there. That struck me as odd. She was working remotely that week, or at least that's what she told me on Monday. Said she needed space to finish a presentation for an upcoming board meeting. She'd made a big deal about how much pressure she was under, how she'd barely have time to eat. I hadn't questioned it. Why would I? I stepped into the house and was met by silence. Not just the absence of noise, but an active kind of stillness, the kind that wraps around you like a warning. The living room was tidy. Her coffee mug sat half full on the end table, beside a folded blanket and her phone charger, still plugged in but without the phone. There was a faint scent in the air, her perfume, mixed with something else. Something muskier, not mine. I moved through the kitchen, past the hallway, and paused at the base of the stairs. That's when I heard it. Laughter. Soft, distant, and definitely not alone. A male voice, warm and low, blending with her laugh. One I hadn't heard in a long time. Not the polite chuckle she gave me when I made a joke, but that deep, unguarded laugh, the kind that rises from the chest. It floated down from upstairs, pierced the quiet like sunlight through a closed curtain. I didn't call out. I didn't stomp or demand answers. I just walked, slow and deliberate, up the stairs. I don't know what I expected to find. Maybe nothing. Maybe everything. My heart was loud in my chest, but my face stayed calm. It was like some part of me had stepped out of the moment, observing it from a distance. The bedroom door was cracked open. Light poured from inside. I pushed it gently, barely making a sound. The room was empty, but her laptop was open on the bed. A video call was still active. The man on the screen wore a gray t-shirt and leaned back in what looked like a hotel bed. He was grinning, mid-laugh, and frozen in place. The video had paused. But it was enough. The background in his video was unmistakable. The same floral wallpaper. The same decorative pillows. The same navy blue curtains. Our bedroom. No, that wasn't right. Not quite our bedroom. I stepped closer and looked again. The pillows were similar, but the lighting was warmer. The curtains were thicker, and the nightstand wasn't ours. A hotel. Somewhere designed to look like a home, to trick the mind into comfort. But what made it all worse wasn't the room behind him. It was the look on his face. Smug. Familiar. Int asterisk mate. He wasn't performing for the camera. He wasn't posing. He was comfortable. At ease. And behind his smile, I saw recognition. Not of me, but of a woman he knew well. Knew closely. I sat down on the edge of the bed, staring at the screen. My hands didn't shake. I clicked the spacebar. The video resumed. Caitlin's voice came through, light and teasing. She was off camera, but I could hear the sound of sheets rustling, the clink of a glass being set down, the distinct chime of hotel room service trays. She giggled. He called her by a name I hadn't heard in years. A nickname from college she'd once told me she hated. The video lasted another 30 seconds before it ended. The screen returned to her desktop. I didn't mean to snoop further, but I did. Her message history was still open. A string of chats, all recent. Her most frequent contact was Evan G., the same name from Instagram. Shutter guy. The man with the vague bio and filtered skyline photos. The man who had been there in the margins the whole time. I scrolled through the messages. Some were harmless. Jokes about film grain and coffee shops. But most were not. There were flirty messages, subtle at first, then more explicit. Plans to meet during her lunch breaks. References to hotel rooms by their numbers. Photos not nude, but suggestive enough. Conversations layered in subtext. Can't wait to try that lens again, he wrote in one. You looked so good next to the window. She replied with heart emojis. With anticipation. With familiarity. And then there was one message that punched through the rest. LOL. He saw the jacket in the car. Told him it belonged to some Trevor. Poor guy. I stopped reading. I closed the laptop slowly. My hands finally trembled. Not with rage. Not even sorrow. With finality. The truth was a blade, and I had let it slide quietly under my skin for weeks. Now, it had gone deep enough to sever something essential. There was no shouting, no slamming walls or breaking plates. I simply sat there, in the same room where we used to sleep, surrounded by furniture that now felt like props on a stage. I got up and walked back downstairs. I stood in the kitchen, staring at the fridge. The hum was louder than I remembered. My reflection in the stainless steel door looked unfamiliar. Pale, older, tired in a way I hadn't felt the day before. My body felt heavy, like it had inherited the weight of every lie I had ignored. She came home an hour later. I heard the garage door open, the car door, the sound of her heels on the tile. She entered the kitchen, set down her keys, and greeted me like nothing had happened. She was wearing that same sweatshirt, the one she always wore when she wanted to seem casual and trustworthy. Like a costume. I didn't say anything. I nodded once, poured myself a glass of water, and walked past her to the den. I sat down, turned on the television, and stared through the screen. I never told her what I found. Not that day. Not the next. There was no point, because I didn't need her to explain. I didn't want her to confirm anything. The confirmation had already happened. It had happened in the paused frame of Evan's smile, in the sound of her laugh recorded for someone else, in the mocking reference to my question about the jacket. That was the moment it all ended. Not with fireworks, not with a scream, but with the click of a laptop closing. In the days that followed, I didn't confront Caitlin. I didn't accuse her, didn't ask questions, didn't hint that I knew anything. The silence between us wasn't born from fear or confusion. It was born from clarity. I had seen enough. I had heard her laughter in another man's hotel room. I had read her words, the ones where I was reduced to a joke. There was nothing left to uncover. The mystery was solved, and now I was simply sitting in its aftermath, waiting for the dust to settle around me. I stopped sleeping in our bed. At first, I claimed I was having back pain and needed the firmer surface of the couch. She didn't question it much. She offered to switch places, said I could take the bed and she'd sleep on the couch if it helped. But I declined. I didn't want her gesture. I didn't want anything from her. I just wanted space. So I began sleeping in the living room, and over time I made it mine. I brought in a blanket from the guest closet, the one with the soft fleece lining she never liked. I stopped folding it in the morning. I stopped pretending it was temporary. I left a water bottle by the end table, a book face down on the armrest, my phone plugged into the charger at the wall. The couch became my territory, a quiet exile of my own making. Caitlin noticed. Of course she did. But she didn't ask why. Not directly. Instead, she tried to tiptoe her way back toward normalcy. She'd make extra coffee in the mornings and slide the mug across the counter with a smile. She started making small talk again. About news stories, her coworkers, her sister's upcoming wedding. I listened. I nodded. I answered when it was necessary. But the spark, the warmth, the curiosity, the instinct to lean closer, it was gone. What remained was politeness. Just that. No more, no less. At night, she'd sometimes sit next to me on the couch, her shoulder brushing mine. She'd reach for the remote and offer to watch something together. I said sure. We watched reruns of shows we'd once loved. But I never laughed. I never touched her hand when it rested near mine. Not because I wanted to punish her, but because it felt like reaching into a memory that no longer belonged to us. She tried to initiate affection once. Slid closer to me one evening and let her fingers trace the edge of my sleeve. Her touch used to mean something. A spark, a weight, a connection. But now it felt cold, not temperature-wise, but in meaning. Hollow. Like someone reciting lines they no longer understood. I gently pulled my arm away, pretending to adjust my position. She froze for a moment, then gave me a tight smile and looked back at the screen. We didn't talk about it. We didn't talk about anything real. Our routines adjusted quickly. In some ways, it was remarkable how quietly we rearranged ourselves. Like two people in a crowded elevator, aware of each other, but avoiding eye contact. We became housemates sharing a mortgage. The same kitchen, the same bathroom, the same front door, but completely different lives playing out within them. I began to spend more time in the basement. I told her I was reorganizing tools or working on the Schwinn again, but mostly, I just sat in the old recliner with a beer, staring at the concrete wall. I'd think about what my life used to feel like, not in terms of joy, but in terms of certainty. And then I'd think about how easily that certainty had cracked, how effortlessly it had all come undone when I stopped pretending not to see the truth. She noticed my absence from the bedroom, the kitchen table, the weekend grocery runs. She started trying harder. The gestures began to stack. She'd cook meals she hadn't made in years. Things I used to mention missing, even if just once in passing. Her lasagna, the rosemary chicken, that weird curry dish we tried on our 3rd anniversary. She'd set the table, pour wine, light a candle, and act like everything was just like before. But when we sat down to eat, it was like dining with a stranger wearing my wife's face. She'd chew carefully, watching me for reactions. I'd eat in silence, swallow without tasting, thank her afterward, and leave the dishes behind. She started leaving small notes, too, written on sticky pads, stuck to the bathroom mirror, the fridge, the inside of my closet door. Things like, "Have a great day, Redheart," or "You've got this." Sweet, harmless things. But all they did was remind me of how distant she'd been when it actually mattered. Back when I needed her to say something, anything, and she'd stayed silent. Our texts became practical. Grocery lists, reminders, updates about appointments. No emojis, no inside jokes, no flirtation. I would wake up before her and go for long walks without explanation. I'd sit in the park alone, watching people who weren't us hold hands and laugh like there was nothing hanging between them. I wasn't angry. I wasn't even bitter. I was just numb. That's the word I kept circling back to. Numb. Not because I didn't feel, but because I felt too much all at once and my body decided to shut the valves. Protect itself. Limit exposure. I moved through the house like a ghost wearing my own skin. Functioning. Present. But not alive. One night, I found myself scrolling through old photos on my phone. Vacations, birthday dinners, random selfies from the early years. In so many of them, she was smiling. And I was smiling, too. But I could feel the distance even in those images. Like we were already starting to drift apart and just didn't know it yet. I wanted to delete the album. My thumb hovered over the trash icon. But I couldn't do it. Not yet. Instead, I backed out and opened a blank note. I began writing thoughts. Not as a letter, not as a message to her, but as a record. Personal log. My truth. I wrote about how it felt to discover the messages. How it felt to realize I'd been made into a background character in my own life. How it felt to lie beside someone who had already left me in her heart. Weeks. Maybe months before I even knew. Writing helped. Not in a healing way, but in a way that made the numbness a little more defined, a little less chaotic. I filled 10 pages in 2 nights. None of it was poetic. None of it asked for closure. It was just facts. Observations. The anatomy of a quiet death, not of a person, but of a marriage. One morning, I noticed she was crying in the bathroom. She thought I couldn't hear her. The door was closed, the water running. But I recognized the sound of someone's stifling sobs, the irregular breathing, the quiet sniffles. I didn't go to her. I didn't knock. I just stood in the hallway, hand resting on the doorframe, and listened. I thought maybe this would be the moment she'd come out and say something. That she'd tell me she knew I knew. That she'd confess. Beg. Explain. But she didn't. When she emerged, her eyes were red. She smiled at me weakly and said good morning. I said it back. We didn't speak of it again. That was the new rhythm. Polite. Empty. Mechanical. She began to text me midday, asking how my day was going. I always responded kindly. She'd offer to meet for lunch. I'd say I was busy. She started suggesting we take a weekend trip. Just the 2 of us. Somewhere quiet. I made excuses. I told her my work was unpredictable. I told her I needed to finish some projects. I told her I wasn't sleeping well. All of that was true. But the real truth was that I no longer wanted to go anywhere with her. Not even across the street. Not even into memory. She had moved on before I ever did, and now, ironically, I was the one leaving. Quietly, gently, piece by piece. Not in body, but in heart. It started slowly, her shift from indifference to desperation. Like a tide trying to reclaim a shoreline it had spent years receding from. At first, she played it subtle. More smiles in the morning. a hand brushing my arm when passing behind me in the kitchen. She began asking about my day again with genuine effort, as if hoping her interest might stitch back what had already unraveled. But by then I had gone too quiet to reach. I was still there, brushing my teeth next to her, sipping coffee across the table, folding laundry in the same room, but I was somewhere else entirely. My mind was in a place where I no longer trusted the sound of her voice, no longer leaned toward her warmth, no longer looked for her in a crowd. And I think that scared her more than any confrontation ever could have. One Thursday afternoon, I came home to the scent of rosemary and garlic. She was cooking, not heating something frozen, but really cooking, from scratch. On the table sat roasted vegetables, herb chicken, fresh bread wrapped in a towel to keep it warm. Wine glasses gleamed in the soft light of dusk. My plate was already served, my napkin folded. A candle flickered between us like a hopeful truce. We ate in near silence. She asked questions, tried light conversation. I answered, but only enough to keep the meal from collapsing into discomfort. She offered dessert, creme brulee in little glass cups. She'd never made it before, said she wanted to try something new. I nodded, took 2 bites and thanked her. When I stood to clear the dishes, she reached for my hand. It hung there, her hand, suspended, soft and trembling, waiting for mine to meet it. I looked at it for a second too long, then stepped away to grab the plates. She didn't follow me into the kitchen. That was the night she cried herself to sleep, though she tried to hide it. I could hear her from the living room, the muffled sobs, the restless shifting beneath the blankets. I didn't move from the couch. I didn't speak. I just stared at the ceiling, hands folded behind my head, listening to the sound of regret finally catching up with her. In the days that followed, her gestures intensified. Every morning began with something new. Breakfast made before I woke up, a handwritten note tucked into my coat pocket, a playlist of songs we used to love suddenly playing on the living room speaker. She started suggesting things we hadn't done in years. A trip to Door County, kayaking at Devil's Lake, visiting her cousin's cabin where we'd once spent a snowy weekend in blissful silence, years before things changed. I refused them all with a tired kindness. Not to be cruel, but because every offer felt like it was addressed to someone who no longer lived here. She wasn't trying to love me now. She was trying to love a version of me that only existed in the rearview mirror, the man I used to be before her betrayal drew a permanent boundary between us. One Saturday morning, she walked into the living room dressed in the flannel shirt I used to wear when we first dated. Oversized, faded, sleeves rolled up to her elbows, her hair tied back loosely, no makeup. She carried 2 mugs of coffee and sat beside me on the couch like we were in some old Snapsh * tea of our younger selves. She handed me the mug and rested her head lightly on my shoulder. For a minute I didn't move. I let her stay there. I stared at the wall across from us, the same blank canvas I had come to memorize in all its nothingness. Then I stood up, gently, without words. I walked into the garage and stayed there for over an hour, pretending to sort through boxes I had already organized a dozen times. When I returned, she was gone from the room. Her mug sat untouched on the coffee table. The next week, she began rewriting history. She started bringing up old memories, not as nostalgia, but as evidence. Remember when we danced in the kitchen to that awful jazz album? Remember our last night in Chicago, when the hotel fire alarm went off and we had to sleep in the lobby? Remember when we couldn't stop laughing in the car because the GPS kept saying, "Turn left," and there was no road? I remembered all of it, but I didn't smile, because those memories weren't enough anymore. They had been painted over by something heavier, darker, something that couldn't be undone by sentiment or laughter. She had made me doubt not just the present, but the past, and I didn't know how to trust any of it anymore. Her apologies began soon after. They were never grand or dramatic, just quietly inserted between sentences like commas. She'd pause during dinner and say, "I know I wasn't always there for you," or after brushing her teeth at night, "I made mistakes. I see that now." One evening she sat on the floor of the laundry room, folding towels, and said aloud, "I didn't realize what I was risking. I thought I was just lost." But I found out too late. I didn't respond to any of them. Not because I wanted to hurt her, but because I didn't believe her sorrow was about me. It was about herself, her shame, her fear, her realization that the man who used to love her without hesitation no longer looked at her that way, or looked at her at all. Then came the night she begged. It was past midnight. I had just come in from a walk. The air outside had been cold, sharp enough to sting my skin. I liked the pain. It reminded me I still existed. I kicked off my shoes, walked into the kitchen, and found her sitting at the table. Eyes swollen, shoulders hunched. Her phone lay face down in front of her like a dead thing. She stood when she saw me, walked slowly across the kitchen. She reached for my hand again, but this time, she grabbed it, and she didn't let go. Her voice cracked as she spoke. Her words poured out fast, jumbled, emotional, unfinished. She said she had ended it weeks ago, that it had been a mistake, a moment of stupidity, not a reflection of what I meant to her, that she had been searching for something she didn't even understand, that she missed us, that she had felt me slipping away and it terrified her more than anything she'd ever felt. Then she said she loved me, not softly, not romantically, but with urgency, with panic. She begged me to look at her, to touch her, to say something. She pressed my hand against her face, tears streaking over my knuckles, breathing fast and shallow like she was trying to bring something dead back to life with touch alone. I didn't pull away, but I didn't hold her either. I let my hand drop. I turned and walked toward the hallway, my steps slow and deliberate, my face unreadable. I heard her fall to her knees behind me. I heard the sob, raw and sudden, tear through the silence like a scream held too long. But I didn't turn back. She had flinched away from my touch for months. Now, when she begged for it, when her fingers trembled at the thought of losing even that, I had none left to give. She had taught me how to live without her, and I had learned well. By the time she reached out, I had already walked miles in the opposite direction. Not physically, but emotionally, spiritually, quietly. Her panic was real, but it had come too late. I stopped waiting for closure. Each morning I rose earlier. I started lifting weights again, something I hadn't done in years. The pain reminded me I was still here. I reconnected with old friends, the kind she never liked. I drove out to small towns with my camera, capturing life beyond our house.